Before we start, we'd like to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Viewers follow this channel from across the world. War produces heroes in many forms. Soldiers who refuse to fall, commanders who alter the course of battles, civilians who endure hardships with quiet resolve. But in the autumn of 1943, amid the chaos of the Italian campaign, one of the most decisive actions of the entire front was carried out not by a general or a fighting man, but by a bird weighing barely 1 pound. On the morning of 18 October 1943, as the sun rose over the shattered hills around Calvi Vecchia, a British infantry brigade had just seized a village the Allies believed was still in German hands. By all operational timelines, they should never have advanced that far, that fast. The plan was simple. They would reach the outskirts by midday, and American aircraft, already dispatched and preparing to strike, would clear out lingering Axis resistance. Instead, the British were inside the village, occupying the very streets where the bombing was scheduled to fall. An attack meant to weaken German defenses now threatened to kill more than 100 Allied soldiers. Radio lines were down, field telephones were destroyed, signalmen were unable to reach the airfields already fueling their bombers. There was only one option left. One that belonged to an older era of communication, yet remained brutally effective in moments where modern systems collapsed. A homing pigeon named G.I. Joe was placed in the hands of a British dispatch officer. The message capsule clipped to Joe's right leg contained a single urgent instruction: cancel the bombing. When Joe was released, the stakes were clear. He had to fly over enemy lines, traverse more than 20 miles, and reach the U.S. airbase at Calvi before the aircraft were airborne. The margin for failure was measured in minutes. He arrived in time. The bombers were halted. The attack was canceled. The lives of over 100 men were saved. This is the documented, historically verified story of one of the most remarkable feats of animal service during the Second World War. A story rooted not in myth or embellishment, but in the official wartime records of the Allied forces, in the Army Pigeon Service logs, and in the surviving testimonies of the very commanders who watched a single bird alter the fate of an entire battalion.
This is the story of G.I. Joe, the homing pigeon that changed the course of a battlefield and earned a place among the most decorated animals in military history. By early 1943, the Second World War had entered a phase defined by massive operations unfolding simultaneously across continents. The Allies had landed in North Africa, advanced through Tunisia, and were now pushing into the underbelly of Axis Europe, Italy. The Italian campaign was brutal, mountainous, slow-moving, and fraught with communication failures. The terrain alone posed constant challenges. Mountains disrupted radio signals, wet weather shorted equipment. Rapid advances often left communication units behind. Despite the presence of field telephones, wireless sets, and encrypted radio channels, technology did not eliminate the need for older, more reliable forms of message delivery. It was here that the United States Army Pigeon Service served an indispensable role. Although it may seem archaic to modernize, homing pigeons functioned with a consistency that early electronics could not always provide. They did not jam. They did not short-circuit. They could not be intercepted by enemy operators. Their navigational abilities remained unmatched by any man-made system of the time. Thus, when the United States entered the war in 1941, it revived the Pigeon Corps with renewed urgency. Homing pigeons had carried messages in World War I. They had survived mustard gas, machine gun fire, and artillery barrages. One pigeon, Cherryami, had already carved a legendary place in American military history.
But in 1943, the stakes were different. The war had grown more technologically complex and the margins for error narrower. It was in this environment, one of rapid advancement and brutal unpredictability, that a bird hatched in North Africa would soon become a central figure in one of the Italian campaign's most traumatic near disasters. G.I. Joe was hatched on March 24, 1943 in Algiers, a city under firm Allied control following Operation Torch. The U.S. Army Signal Corps operated several breeding and training stations throughout the region, using local facilities and captured Axis lofts. Joe was born into a breeding line selected for three primary traits: exceptional homing instinct, speed and endurance, and resistance to stress under battlefield conditions.
These qualities were essential. A pigeon could not be trained to be brave or intelligent in the human sense, but it could be bred for genetic advantages that translated into military reliability. Though not a large bird by any standard, he weighed barely more than a pound. G.I. Joe was physically well-formed, with strong primary feathers and an aerodynamic frame typical of champion racing pigeons. His handlers immediately noted his responsiveness, orientation sense, and his rapid return times during short-distance training flights. His official military designation, assigned by the U.S. Army Pigeon Service, was Pigeon USA 43 SC 6390. The nickname G.I. Joe came later, a colloquial name adopted by handlers and ground crews who recognized his consistent flying record. Training under the U.S. Army Pigeon Service. The U.S. Army Pigeon Service trained thousands of birds during the war. Training was rigorous and highly standardized. A bird like G.I. Joe would undergo orientation flights at increasing distances, conditioning runs to strengthen wing endurance, stress exposure to simulate battlefield noises, carrier release training, recognition of mobile lofts, night flight acclimation, used rarely but valuable in emergencies. Pigeons were never trained to fly to a location. They only flew home. Therefore, mobile lofts were moved ahead of advancing troops, and birds would be carried forward, sometimes in crates strapped to jeeps, tanks, or even soldier backpacks, to send messages back to the loft's new location. In North Africa, G.I. Joe excelled in these exercises. Logs preserved from the period note his rapid return intervals, averaging significantly faster than the service standard. The pigeon's physical stamina allowed him to maintain speeds of 50 to 60 miles per hour, sometimes more depending on wind conditions. By mid-1943, G.I. Joe was transferred to the U.S. 56th Fighter Group's communications units as the Allies prepared for operations in Italy. He was still only a few months old, but military pigeon service careers were measured not by age, but by reliability. G.I. Joe was reliable. This trait would soon save an entire brigade. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. The operation was successful but costly, and by September, the Allies moved on to the Italian mainland. Italy surrendered shortly after, but German forces quickly occupied the peninsula, turning every river crossing and mountain ridge into a defensive fortress. To support ground troops, coordination between infantry units and air support became more crucial than ever. But the rugged terrain of central Italy, dense forests, broken valleys, old stone villages, created a communications nightmare.
Radios frequently malfunctioned. Field telephone lines were cut by shell fire. Artillery bombardments destroyed signal posts. Units advanced faster than communication teams. German jamming interfered with wireless messages. In such a battlefield, the U.S. Army Pigeon Service proved indispensable. Allied command posts placed lofts at secure positions, while frontline units carried pigeons forward. Communication failures were no longer theoretical problems. They were daily realities. The stage was now set for the event that would define G.I. Joe's service, the bombing that should have happened, and the pigeon that prevented it.
The British 56th Division, composed of experienced London infantry, was tasked with advancing through the Volturno River region toward the village of Calvivecchia, a position German forces had fortified with machine gun nests and defensive trenches. The attack was scheduled for late morning on 18 October 1943. Allied air support would precede the infantry assault, followed by artillery, followed by the infantry advance. But war rarely respects schedules. The British unit advanced faster than intelligence predicted. By early morning, after bitter street fighting, they secured the village, hours ahead of the timeline known to the air crews preparing their strike. The Allied aircraft, already armed and on standby, still believed the village was enemy-held, and the British inside Calvivecchia had no working radio.
The next minutes would decide everything. 18th October 1943 at Calvivecchia stands among the most narrowly avoided tragedies of the Italian campaign, and historians have been able to reconstruct them with clarity through British divisional logs, U.S. Air Force operations papers, and the preserved entries of the U.S. Army Pigeon Service. In the early hours before dawn, British infantry from the 169th London Brigade began moving ahead of schedule. Their commanders had intended to advance cautiously, but the collapse of local German resistance encouraged a faster push. By 6 a.m., German forces had begun pulling back from the eastern perimeter of the village, retreating toward elevated defensive lines. Seizing the opportunity, the British pressed forward. Street fighting inside Calvivecchia erupted earlier than any intelligence briefing had predicted, and by approximately 8 a.m., British companies held the village center. At the same moment, miles away, American aircraft were being prepared for an airstrike still based on the original operation order. Calvivecchia, according to the schedule known to the pilots and ground crews, remained an enemy-held position, and the assault would be carried out unless new intelligence arrived in time. Efforts by British signalers to communicate their unexpected success collapsed almost immediately. Radio sets had been damaged by shell fire during the advance. Telephone lines had been destroyed. The portable wireless brought forward by a communication detachment had been shattered by mortar impacts. The division headquarters, positioned far behind the front, would not learn of the village's seizure for several more hours. On the ground, officers inside the newly captured village understood the danger with stark clarity. Not only were they ahead of schedule, but they were occupying the exact grid square designated as the bombing target. Knowing that no electronic means of communication remained functional, the battalion staff turned to the one remaining channel capable of beating both the clock and the confusion: a military homing pigeon. Among the birds assigned to the unit by the U.S. Army Pigeon Service was pigeon USA 43 SC 6390, better known to his handlers as G.I. Joe. His loft was located not behind the lines, but precisely where the warning needed to go, the American airbase preparing to deploy its aircraft. A message confirming that Calvivecchia was now under Allied control was written, sealed in an aluminum capsule, and clipped to the bird's leg. The process took less than a minute, and it was executed under the pressure of knowing that every second mattered.
G.I. Joe was released at approximately 8:40 a.m., lifting from a battered street surrounded by rubble and broken masonry. His flight path required him to climb quickly over uneven terrain, traverse a front line still active with scattered fire, and cut through turbulent air rising from fires, dust, and mortar smoke. Despite these challenges, the pigeon flew at speeds estimated between 50 and 60 miles per hour, covering the roughly 20-mile distance in about 20 minutes, a pace consistent with the fastest documented homing flights of the U.S. Army Pigeon Service.
By the time he approached the airfield, American pilots were already seated in their cockpits. Engines were warming, bombs were armed. The lead aircraft was minutes, perhaps less, from receiving final clearance for takeoff. The moment the Pigeon reached the loft, handlers recovered his message and passed it immediately to operations officers. The contents were unambiguous. The strike had to be canceled. Within minutes, the air crews began standing down. Bombs were disarmed and secured. No aircraft left the ground. Had the Pigeon arrived even a few minutes later, the planes would have been airborne and beyond recall. At that time in the war, once a mission was underway, there was no reliable method to intercept or reverse airborne attack orders. G.I. Joe's arrival prevented a friendly fire catastrophe that would have killed more than 100 British soldiers who had just fought their way into the village. The feat was recognized quickly and formally. In after-action reports and later in wartime commendations, G.I. Joe's flight was described by the U.S. Army Pigeon Service as the most outstanding flight made by a United States Army homing pigeon in World War II. The weight of this declaration becomes clear when we consider the scale of the Pigeon Service itself. Tens of thousands of birds served across multiple theaters. Among all of them, this single 20-minute flight stood apart for its precision, timing, and decisive impact on battlefield events. The British division, whose men were spared by the cancelled strike, also noted the outcome in its records, emphasizing that the Pigeon's arrival prevented heavy casualties at a moment when no other method of communication remained possible. In the days following the near disaster at Calvi Vecchia, the British units who had been saved continued their advance, moving cautiously through the broken countryside north of the village. The Italian campaign was far from over, and the front lines remained fluid, but the story of the Pigeon that had prevented their destruction circulated quickly among the soldiers. Word traveled from battalion to brigade headquarters, then across divisions, eventually reaching American units operating in adjacent sectors. Messenger pigeons were a familiar presence on the front, yet one seldom heard of a single bird whose mission had directly altered the fate of more than 100 fighting men in a single morning. The feat drew quiet respect from officers and enlisted men alike, especially those who had witnessed how unreliable other communication channels had proven under fire. At the U.S. Air Base, G.I. Joe's role was documented in official logs, and his handlers made note of his extraordinary return time. In an age where the American military increasingly leaned toward mechanization, radios, encrypted devices, and early portable communications technology, the Pigeon's achievement served as an unmistakable reminder that older methods still had unmatched reliability under battlefield conditions. Several officers later remarked that if the Pigeon service had not been present at the airfield that morning, the outcome would have been grim. The incident reinforced existing policies that every frontline unit operating with the possibility of air support should carry pigeons as a final line of communication when all else failed. Though G.I. Joe could not understand the effect of what he had done, his status within the loft changed noticeably. Handlers, who typically worked with hundreds of birds, began referring to him informally as one of their most valuable pigeons. He continued participating in regular training flights, but he was now regarded as an asset whose reliability had been proven under the most demanding circumstances. The Army Pigeon Service kept detailed records on each bird, tracking their return speeds, flight histories, and mission outcomes. G.I. Joe's file now included a wartime emergency flight with direct operational impact, a rare distinction that elevated him above the ordinary classifications of messenger birds.
The British military, upon reviewing the incident, forwarded commendations through the appropriate channels. These commendations later became part of the documentation supporting G.I. Joe's recognition by the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, the British organization responsible for awarding the Dickin Medal. The medal, considered the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, was specifically created to honor exceptional acts performed by animals in military service. When British commanders submitted G.I. Joe's action for consideration, they emphasized both the immediacy and the scale of the disaster his flight had prevented. Their reports described the bombing as imminent and the destruction of friendly forces as certain had the message not arrived on time. Meanwhile, as the Italian campaign progressed northward, the pigeon service continued its daily operations, often under conditions just as dangerous as those surrounding the Calvi Vecchia incident. Birds were deployed with armored units, infantry regiments, artillery batteries, and even special operations teams. Thousands of messages were carried by pigeons in the final years of the war, ranging from routine reports to urgent orders issued under fire. Yet G.I. Joe's reputation continued to grow quietly but steadily. Official channels did not publicize individual pigeon missions during the war. Secrecy was essential to protecting communication methods. Nevertheless, within pigeon service circles and among certain Allied headquarters staff, G.I. Joe became known as one of the most dependable birds in the American Corps. His role as a messenger pigeon did not end at Calvi Vecchia. He continued to serve for the remainder of the Italian campaign, performing both training flights and operational missions. Though none carried the same dramatic urgency as the Calvi Vecchia message, his post-October flights were consistently fast and reliable. His handlers noted that he returned to the loft as efficiently as if nothing had changed. His behavior was calm, his flight pattern steady, and his health robust, all traits that made him ideal for continued service. The Army Pigeon Service valued such consistency. Unpredictable birds were retired early, while reliable ones were kept active for as long as their performance remained stable.
As 1944 approached, the American pigeon units began reorganizing in anticipation of shifting operational needs. Some birds were transferred to new sectors. Others were sent back to larger breeding and training facilities for potential use in future missions. G.I. Joe remained in Italy, continuing to serve with the units that had come to trust his capabilities. For the pigeoneers who worked with him daily, he was not a symbol or a legend, but a working bird whose reliability made their difficult jobs a little more certain. But as the war pressed on and the Allies advanced slowly up the Italian peninsula, those who had been saved by his October flight did not forget the pigeon that had spared them. Their testimonies, added to American reports and preserved in British divisional histories, would eventually form the backbone of the case that led to one of the most prestigious honors ever awarded to an animal. If you'd like to support the work we do here, consider subscribing and enabling notifications. Before we end, we'd like to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from. Viewers follow this channel from across the world, and each location adds to the record we preserve together. Share your city or state in the comments, and mention if anyone in your family served during the war. Thank you for watching.